Thank you very much, Iris. And I'd like to start by just thanking Iris and Victor for inviting me to this wonderful workshop and having a workshop on waste. I'll share my screen now so we can get my slideshow up. And what I would like to do for you today is offer a brief overview of the ways that urban history has treated waste management issues over the past half century, and discuss what an urban history approach brings to the interdisciplinary field of discard studies. What I won't do is present an exhaustive discussion of historical approaches to waste. If you've read any of the books that Iris just described, you might see the fingerprints of Susan Strasser's approach to changing production and consumption practices, and Sue Ellen Hoy's attention to changing sanitary standards. They're very strong influences on my work in ways that I'm not touching on in this talk. Nor am I doing a comprehensive overview of urban environmental history. William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis, for example, is extremely influential on that field for his analysis of the changing relationships between cities and rural areas due to industrialization. Instead, what I'm going to do is discuss the role of two major figures in urban history for both their own scholarship and for a book series they've edited over the past 2 decades. I will then discuss the volume Steve Corey and I have edited for that series and conclude with some thoughts about directions for future research. First, a brief note about urban history. If I'm to be overly reductive, the field of history is the analysis of past human activities, often through the use of archival narrative records to identify patterns of change and continuity. One of the reasons urban history is a fruitful approach to discards is that it is an interdisciplinary field. Urban historians merge the focus of patterns of change and continuity over time with evidence and methodology of other social science disciplines to address relevant questions. Much of this work has involved the demographics of urban community, and a crucial discipline for urban history is geography, a spatial analysis of what the site of cities are, where people live and work, and the characteristics of the built environment are all central concerns of urban historians. Demography and geography are just two of the disciplines that urban historians have drawn from to shape our inquiries. And two key figures have shaped urban history's approach to discards. The first I will mention is Joel Tarr. Joel Tarr's work exemplifies the interdisciplinary approach of urban history, as his career was shaped by fields not only outside of history, but outside of the social sciences and humanities. While the standard publication in history is the solo-authored monograph book, because Tarr's approach is influenced by environmental engineers, he is an extraordinarily prolific author and co-author of articles he has placed in history, policy, and engineering journals. The slide I'm showing right now includes only 3 of his publications, and here I'll point out a key contribution he made was published 50 years ago, assessing the role of the horse as the polluter of the late 19th century city. The pollution problem of manure and horse carcasses necessitated new strategies to rid streets of the waste that ensued, and in fact, he and Clay McShane later wrote a book called The Horse in the City that expanded on this article. The publication of the original article in American Heritage began a half century of several dozen publications, many of which are collected in his 1996 volume, The Search for the Ultimate Sink: Urban Pollution in Historical Perspective. Now, what does that title mean? Get to that in 1 second. Tarr's research involves 2 important conceptual contributions to discard studies. The first is his adoption of sanitary engineer Abel Woolman's model of urban metabolism to understand the processes that keep a city functioning. Cities require constant inputs of food, water, and energy, and they also require constant releases of waste. So the model of urban metabolism is useful at assessing how cities have built and maintained practices to handle these processes. The second contribution involves the kinds of practices cities have used to handle wastes. Tarr posits that there are 3 possible places or sinks to place wastes: the air, the land, and the water. Much of his work has been to show how cities have attempted to use landfills, water dumping, and incineration to manage wastes. and what the consequences of those decisions have had for people and for ecosystems. Tarr's collection of essays is titled The Search for the Ultimate Sink because he argues that cities' approaches to pollution is to find an ultimate solution. The ultimate sink is one where we could freely discard sewages or garbage or industrial waste without any consequence. Tarr stresses that an ultimate sink is impossible to find, and over time, the consequences of using a sink present themselves and require adaptations. For Tarr, the challenge for urban society is to address the consequences of disposal rather than pretending discarding can be done without worry, out of sight, and out of mind. Now, the second figure I want to talk about today is Martin Melosi. His work focuses on how the built environment and nature in cities shape each other, with particular emphasis on waste management and energy infrastructures. Melosi adopts the traditional historical publication model of the solo-authored monograph, and this slide identifies only 3 of his many books he has published. Melosi builds upon Tarr's model in his work and contributes crucial understandings about the history of infrastructure. As particularly as discussed in his 2000 book, The Sanitary City, once cities design and invest in an infrastructure such as a sewer system, issues of time, convenience, and cost lock them into that infrastructure decision for decades. This concept, which Melosi adopted from political science, is called path dependence. These 2 images that I'm about to show changes in New York City's transportation infrastructure. A street in 19th century Manhattan is saturated with horse manure, indicating a commitment to animals as transport and the streets as the site to manage the wastes. The photo above is a subway station where a train devoted to handling the collected garbage from several stations is parked. Billions of dollars of investment shaped the infrastructure of the train, and it allows waste to be removed easily. I'll also say here that the wastes are, of course, very different. The 21st century image involves less excrement and more synthetic materials, mostly polymers. Melosi's use of path dependence has allowed him to explain why contemporary sewage, garbage collection, and energy systems may endure despite our understandings of what might be more efficient options or what may best contribute to human and ecosystem health. If, say, people in New York City are annoyed the city's beaches are closed after a rainstorm because of combined sewage overflow, Melosi's work helps them understand that the money and years of construction that created a combined wastewater system resist easy modification or replacement. I'll mention one more book of Melosi's, which is a recent history done last year of New York City's sink for garbage, the Fresh Kills landfill on Staten Island. And I mention it because it is a recent attempt to grapple with the potential discard studies has to shape urban history. It comes after several years of a Tarr and Melosi project that is relevant to this discussion, inspired by a book about St. Louis. In 1997, the environmental historian Andrew Hurley edited a volume on the environmental history of St. Louis for the Missouri Historical Society. Several chapters of Common Fields focus on aspects of pollution and waste. This book proved to be a very successful model for investigating how one city has a variety of environmental challenges that it attempts to solve over time. Tarr and Melosi found the model so useful that they proposed to create a series of such studies. And they established the History of the Urban Environment series at the University of Pittsburgh Press about 20 years ago. In addition to publishing new editions of The Sanitary City and Garbage in the City, the 2 books of Melosi's that I put on the 2 slides ago, the series features several edited volumes influenced by Common Fields, focusing on cities including Los Angeles, Montreal, London, Krakow, Philadelphia, New Orleans, Boston, Houston, and Pittsburgh. These last 2 cities are not coincidental. Melosi spent most of his career at the University of Houston, and Tarr has been a professor at Pittsburgh's Carnegie Mellon University since 1967. The first of the edited volumes in the series they published at the University of Pittsburgh was a book on Pittsburgh, edited by Joel Tarr. Pittsburgh is a key site for understanding the evolution of environmental history as a discipline. As American Society for Environmental History founders John Opie and Samuel Hayes, along with Joel Tarr, all lived and worked in the one-time steel producer to the world, and found the city's history of acute industrial pollution problems inspiring for their work. Over the next decade and a half, the model that Hurley established for St. Louis and Tarr adopted for Pittsburgh has served the history of the urban environment series well. As the community of discard studies scholars has grown in the past decade, a few of us working in urban environmental history have alerted our colleagues to the importance of discard studies potential. Marty Melosi, Stephen Corey, and I organized a couple of roundtable discussions on discard studies at meetings of the American Society for Environmental History. And when it came time for the History of the Urban Environment series to commission a volume on New York City, we decided that instead of a volume that attempts to address all manner of environmental topics, from parkland to conservation societies, that our focus would primarily be on the ways issues of waste and water shaped modern New York City being after the annexation of the 5 boroughs in 1898. That book, released this past March, is Coastal Metropolis. In this book, we try to paraphrase our colleague, Kara Murphy Schlickling, in doing a history of New York City. You will often see environmental histories of New York City that focus on, say, the development and the maintenance of Central Park in Manhattan. Manhattan is the original borough of New York City. It's the highest profile borough, and it makes sense that there would be iconic looks at Manhattan's environment. What Kara has done in her book, New York Recentered, and what we're doing in this volume, is focus on the way these so-called outer boroughs, the Bronx, Staten Island, Queens, and Brooklyn, are important parts of the city and are sites for waste management decisions that affect the way all New Yorkers live. So briefly, to focus on some of the ways this edited volume does this, I'll talk about a few chapters and then focus on one in particular. Chapter 1 is Joel Tarr's overview of land use, industry, demographics, and pollution issues in the region from the start of the 18th century to the present day. From there, the volume focuses largely on the period from the end of the 19th century to the 21st century. We have several chapters that explore how sewage and industrial waste affect the health of New York Harbor, the Bronx River, and the communities that live around them. Steve Corey has contributed a chapter on the history of political resistance to building incinerators in Brooklyn. Marty Melosi has an overview of the use of smaller islands in the New York Bight to manage the city's wastes. This chapter is also a good introduction to the approach Melosi uses in his 2020 book, Fresh Kills. We also have a history of private and public organic waste composting practices. This chapter is authored by Samantha McBride, and I recommend it to anyone who has read her book, Recycling Reconsidered, which I consider one of the crucial contributions in discard studies, as her chapter follows on that book's systemic analysis of New York City's recycling systems to consider the complexities of composting programs. The land use of the city is something we talk about a lot, and the land of New York City has changed over time. This estuary has been reshaped in part by waste, and Tina Peabody's chapter on the use of landfill to create the 1939 World's Fair site in Queens is one such example. We have several other chapters, and the volume is loosely chronological. The last 2 chapters by Ted Steinberg and myself focus on 21st century efforts to make New York City ostensibly more sustainable. I'd like to spend the rest of my time today discussing Chapter 12, as it involves the use of historical memory of discards for a particular model of development, and it makes the case for a more nuanced use of historical memory informed by discard studies. The focus of Chapter 12 is a little waterway called Newtown Creek. And just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, here is a Google Earth image of the city of New York, and at the center, of course, is Manhattan. The large landmass to my right, to the east of Manhattan, is the Long Island specifically the boroughs of Brooklyn and Queens. And if we zoom in on Google Earth, we see that Brooklyn and Queens are actually divided by a small 3.8-mile tributary to the East River called Newtown Creek. It's a small waterway, but it reveals a lot about New York City's history as well as its present. New York City is currently in a period of intense gentrification. Land use assumptions of what is good and right is, quote, cleaning up, unquote, urban space for development. The lands surrounding Newtown Creek are no exceptions. New condominiums around Newtown Creek provide housing very close to Manhattan's central business district that were for sale at prices of almost $1 million per one-bedroom unit in 2017. And here are some renderings of one of these shiny new condo buildings. What is odd is the booming Newtown Creek area has a reputation of one overwhelmed by pollution. A New Yorker profile of the waterway in 2004 defined it by its relationship with wastes, noting, in comparison to another polluted Brooklyn waterway, the Gowanus Canal, that the creek is, quote, far more polluted, 20 direct sewage portals all its own, and more variably odorous, and with a historic legacy of pollution. The creek is currently home to the largest urban oil spill, 17 million gallons, which is half again as big as the Exxon Valdez dump in the history of North America, unquote. So why are people paying more than $1 million for a one-bedroom condo overlooking such a befouled waterway? Geography provides one answer. Access to Manhattan leads residents to value convenience over other concerns. Newtown Creek's surrounding neighborhoods are close to the trains that will get people to Wall Street or to Times Square very quickly. History provides a more complex answers to why this development is happening. The ways powerful interests describe the history of this place and its myriad of relationships with discards leads to particular visions of development. And here I want to bring in some of the concepts of Martin Melosi and Joel Tarr to understand what is happening now and ways we can think about and critique what is happening now. Understanding how New York City uses Newtown Creek as a discardscape requires at least 3 historical narratives. The 3 narratives that inform the histories of waste management in New York City are the sink, urban metabolism, and the circular economy. More narratives concerning waste may be possible, but examining these 3 allow us to better understand the complexity and the contradictions of what we classify and manage as waste as an industrial society. Doing so not only helps us understand the materials we throw away, but also allows us to analyze the consequences of our practices for the future of the region's land, water, and people. So the first narrative I'll talk about is the sink, and it's the dominant narrative associated with Newtown Creek's redevelopment. If we were to write a story with a narrative arc from beginning to end, this arc would involve long ago industrial activity that pollutes the water and land with hazardous waste. The story concludes by remediating the environmental damage associated with past waste disposal. The United States Environmental Protection Agency's narrative of Newtown Creek dates back to the 1830s as the area around the creek industrialized. By 1870, the EPA site report emphasizes, more than 50 major manufacturing operations were located along Newtown Creek's banks. These included oil refineries, petrochemical plants, fertilizer and glue factories, sawmills, and lumber and coal yards. The area was crowded with commercial vessels such as the boats that you see in the top photo on the slide. This includes large boats bringing in raw materials and fuel and taking out oil, chemicals, and metals. At the time Brooklyn was annexed by New York City in 1898, industrial activity around Newtown Creek involved intensive refinery and fertilizer applications, with acute nuisances from the activities that were observed, particularly issues of odor. This industrial heritage continued into the 20th century when the creek shores were host to more than 40 oil refineries, as well as metal and chemical plants, manufactured gas plants, municipal and industrial discharge pipes, shipping and barging, as well as continued coal handling. Scattered reports of industrial pollutants in the waterway surfaced over the 20th century, but the area saw substantial economic change. Many, not all, but many of the industrial activities around Newtown Creek declined after World War II. In particular, the petroleum industry began to disperse south and west of New York to other parts of the United States, and refinery operations at the former Mobile Brooklyn refinery ceased in the year 1966. With petroleum the focus of much of Newtown Creek's reputation as a sink for industrial wastes, the largely gone petroleum industry thus represents waste as a legacy of a distant past. This framing of pollution as past activity was furthered when the Coast Guard detected signs of an oil spill entering Newtown Creek in the year 1978. Once identified, this led to an investigation that concluded that the area of the spill was over 17 million gallons, spanning 52 acres of land under Greenpoint. The scale of the hazard was great, attributed to an industry that had dominated the area. The logical conclusion to this story was remediation to eliminate the hazard from the now dormant industrial activity. So the process from discovery of the spill to designation of an EPA Superfund site took 3 decades. But in 2009, an EPA investigation concluded that metals, volatile organic compounds, and semi-volatile organic compounds were present in Newtown Creek sediments at concentrations well above levels in nearby locations in the Atlantic Basin. In the early 1990s, New York State determined that the creek was in violation of the Clean Water Act's water quality standards. Both state and federal agencies undertook several investigations of the creek's water and bread, as did interested private entities. The resulting EPA assessment of the area incorporated data from these investigations, leading to federal action. So the story of the sink narrative has a happy ending, at least in the language of the real estate developers who are building the new buildings in the region. Waste can be conquered. In September 2009, Newtown Creek was proposed for the National Priorities List. 1 year later, the EPA listed Newtown Creek on the NPL and designated it as the Superfund site to be remediated. Local politicians view the decision as a major step forward in resolving the area's issues with pollution. Quote, "It's basically good news," said the area's then U.S. House Representative Anthony Weiner. We're on the path to getting this problem remediated," unquote. The implications of the sink narrative involve the pollution of past industrial activities being remediated so the site can be redeveloped. As the EPA was designated the area's Superfund site, New York City rezoned the area for development of approximately 12,000 potential units of housing and nearly 19 acres of public open space in the surrounding neighborhoods of Brooklyn and Queens. Redevelopment naturally follows cleanup in this story, and presumably the new residents investing 7-figure sums in housing will enjoy waterfront views without concern for the pollution central to the area's history for almost 2 centuries. Thinking of Newtown Creek primarily as a sink for past discards, though, obscures important ways in which the people, businesses, and governments interacting with the waterway and its shores have constructed and managed wastes. 2 additional narratives involve these relationships, with narrative arcs that have distinctly different conclusions than the sink narrative does. So if the industrial pollutants at the forefront of the sink narrative require remediation, the biological waste released into Newtown Creek relate to another of the ways in which Joel Tarr discusses urban environments. Tarr argued that thinking of cities having metabolic processes is a means to comprehend the environmental history of cities. Tarr says, just as living things require the input of light and energy, nutrients, water, and air, so do cities, unquote. Living things also require outputs. How do people and how do cities rid themselves of excrement? An urban metabolism narrative, like a sink narrative, involves pollution of the waterway. In the urban metabolism narrative, however, the waste within Newtown Creek are a logical feature highlighting the creek's site and function, serving the rest of New York City. The logic of site informs this narrative. Newtown Creek's location allowed the growing metropolis to develop and expand wastewater management infrastructure in the 19th and 20th centuries, allowing millions of people to perform daily biological functions without risk of epidemic disease. The arc of the urban metabolism narrative is one of technological experts building capacity as the city's population grows. This is a linear, progressive narrative in which the function of managing waste never ceases. If the narrative is altered, it is with a realization in the 21st century that stormwater runoff taxes the infrastructure enough that modifying the built environment to reduce combined sewage overflow events helps manage this vital metabolic processes. So in addition to having the wastewater treatment system, the city is investing in bioswales to absorb more stormwater. Like the sink, the urban metabolism narrative recognizes human health dangers associated with exposure to the wastes. However, the logical conclusion of the urban metabolism narrative does not involve the end of placing waste in the environment. Sewage is recognized as a vital, perpetual function. This narrative has a history dating back to settlement of the area, but as urban density increased in the late 19th century, acute problems necessitated expanding the infrastructure to manage sewage. Heavy use of Newtown Creek for sewage at the turn of the 20th century led to sludge buildups that impeded barge traffic. This problem led to construction of the metropolitan area's largest wastewater treatment facility in 1967. And the photo at the bottom is a picture of mostly the Newtown Creek wastewater treatment facility. New York City Bureau of Water Pollution Control Deputy Director Joseph Canetta and project engineer Robert Foyer designed the plant to control the bacteriological quality of the effluent being released in Newtown Creek as directed by regulating agencies from both the state and federal level. Disinfection of the wastewater was done through chemical means, diffusing sodium hypochlorite solution diffused at the head end of the plant outfall. In the urban metabolism narrative, waste is rationally managed. Sewage passes through mechanical screens, aeration tanks, and sedimentation tanks. It is then subject to straining through grit and disinfection by chemicals, neutralizing the hazards of biological waste. In this system, waste is not a legacy of the past to be removed once and forever, but a constant process to manage. As long as the system is operating correctly, the site can and will handle a constant stream of new wastes. Today, the urban metabolism narrative sees a largely stable wastewater management strategy at Newtown Creek, shaped by decades of developing infrastructure that depends on using the creek to handle excrement. Approximately 20% of all the toilets in New York City direct sewage to this plant, which processes it and releases disinfected water not only into Newtown Creek, but there's a nature walk at the very edge of the wastewater treatment facility that has water fountains, and the water in the water fountains is disinfected sewage water. Now, this strategy, as I mentioned, is upset during storm events when combined sewage overflow is released untreated into the creek. Those events aside, the treatment of their waterway as part of a system to manage biological needs of the urban population is largely unchanged from what it was half a century ago. The pattern of continuity relates to the functioning of managing biological wastes. Activities at the wastewater treatment facility constitute a set of changes relating to a third narrative of Newtown Creek's relationship with both biological and industrial wastes. The third narrative combines aspects of the industrial heritage in the sink narrative and the ongoing processes of the urban metabolism narrative. The circular economy narrative is one that is in favor in the early 21st century, but has its roots in economic activities present through the history of industrial society, the commodification of wastes. In the circular economy narrative, waste was and is a resource to be commodified in both formal and informal systems of reclamation. Much of the history of the circular economy involves recycling metals, glass, textiles, and plastics in both private sector activities and municipal collection programs. More recently, the circular economy narrative is associated with design and engineering approaches that have developed since the 1980s. And there may be some discussion of industrial ecology a little bit later on in the workshop, but very much engineers and corporations have looked at ways of using the circular economy to maximize profit and reduce waste. Circular economy practices have been evident in and around Newtown Creek since at least the 1940s. The city's formal waste management system designed infrastructure and practices to reclaim value from discards in ways that were influenced by the private fertilizer companies active on the water's edges in the 19th century. This includes sludge and methane gas collection efforts in the 1940s that expanded with the opening of the Newtown Creek wastewater treatment facility in 1967. And over the last half century, modifications to that facility have expanded the capture of resources from waste. Amongst the most dramatic elements of New York City's wastewater treatment plant are its 8 futuristic stainless steel-clad digester eggs visible in the top photograph. Processing as much as 1.5 million gallons of sludge every day, the digester eggs are visible from vantage points in Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan, and serve as a landmark for travelers on several of New York City's highways and bridges. The language used in the circular economy narrative is familiar to students of Frederick Winslow Taylor and Henry Ford, and consistent with the technocratic approach to sustainability that New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg's administration emphasized between the years 2001 and 2013. By designing systems to operate efficiently, large technological systems can minimize waste and maximize economic return. With the construction of the digester eggs, the arc of the narrative accelerated to expand more opportunities to commodify waste. And waste in this narrative is defined less as hazard that pollutes the environment than inefficient squandering of resources. The problem of squander has a similar solution to the urban metabolism problem of waste as process. You have trained experts design systems to resolve the problem. In the formal version of the circular economy narrative, the wastewater treatment facility not only disinfects sewage, it extracts valuable fuel from it. Of the methane now captured by the system, local utility National Grid's executive Donald Shabazpour said, quote, "It's a crime that it was just being flared. We found a gas well in the middle of Brooklyn," unquote. While the crime had environmental implications, as methane is a potent greenhouse gas and a threat to public health, the wasted economic value was of particular interest to National Grid. The arc of the circular economy narrative progresses towards further optimizing the system. In 2014, the city announced a plan to expand the feeding of food scraps to the digester eggs in the hopes that hundreds of tons of such waste could be diverted from domestic sources and schools and away from landfills. Further investments are required to continue the arc of the narrative. Currently, National Grid has planned to build a $30 million addition of the plant to squeeze out water vapor and carbon dioxide. So in this way, the formal system of resource capture in the circular economy narrative points to expanded public-private investments in maintaining and expanding the system. The methane capture and sludge collection at the wastewater treatment facility represents examples of formal systems of the circular economy narrative. To the immediate west and south of the wastewater treatment facility's fence lie examples of an informal system of the circular economy that may have a much different future. The advantages of site on the waterway close to Manhattan and close to industry that led to the proliferation of the petroleum and coal industries around Newtown Creek made it one of the region's hubs for scrap metal recycling businesses. Today, scrap yards with names like Greenpoint Scrap Metal, seen in the bottom photo, Fortune Metal, G&G Metals, and Sims Metal Management surround the creek. Trucks come regularly in and out of the region carrying old steel, copper, and aluminum. Workers in the yards separate and sort the metals, preparing them to be shipped out to industrial buyers in New Jersey, across the United States, and overseas to markets in East and South Asia. The risks of industry polluting Newtown Creek, as described in the sink narrative, exists in these activities. Scrap metal recycling produces nuisance odors, particulate matter, and the risks of contaminants flowing into the groundwater and the creek. As the neighborhoods around Newtown Creek are developed for shiny, new, gleaming towers, new real estate developments surround the scrapyards, pointing to a future where the last remnants of the region's industrial heritage are zoned out of an attractive residential area. The arc of the circular economy narrative concludes with the formal system of extracting value from wastewater expanding, as with the urban metabolism narrative, and a tenuous future for the informal system of private scrap dealing as the region gentrifies. The yards themselves may find that their new neighbors see them as nuisances, lingering evidence of a dirty industrial heritage. So, the ways in which the wastes inform the past, present, and future of Newtown Creek involve sinks of a polluted past, but they also involve dynamic processes and reinterpretations of how various wastes are defined and treated. The sink, urban metabolism, and circular economy narratives are important because they reveal intents in the present and future management of the area. The sink narrative concludes with the successful remediation of long ago pollution, conquering waste once and for all. The urban metabolism and circular economy narratives risk presenting a future free from the implications of the discards these functions daily put in the water and the land. Designating the area as a Superfund site is effective at removing petroleum. It will not, however, address future combined sewage overflow events produced by the continued activities at the wastewater treatment facility. Identifying the ways in which waste is managed, commodified, or otherwise used in ways that distinguish the materials from simple disposal does not eliminate the pollution concerns of the sink narrative so much as it illuminates the complex ways in which human activities pollute waterways. Scrap recycling is not a zero waste activity. Processing metals involves risks that have subjected several yards nationwide to designation as Superfund sites. Even, however, if all the scrap yards in the area were closed tomorrow and the workers forced to relocate to more affordable neighborhoods in South Brooklyn, New Jersey, or out of the region entirely, Newtown Creek would still be an active site where discards interact with the waterway. The wastewater treatment facility is an example of these complexities. The facility removes many pollutants from the wastewater. However, some pharmaceuticals, including antidepressants, are able to pass through the facility into the waterway in part because the pharmaceuticals were created after the facility systems were designed. The changing materiality of biological waste stymie the technological systems tasked with removing pollutants, undermining the aspirational conclusion of the sink narrative with a more modern set of toxins. The release of combined sewage overflow waste undermine the efficiency of the urban metabolism and circular economy narratives, and the changing land use patterns in the region threaten private industry that comprises the informal system within the circular economy narrative. Policy and development practices that only take one of these narratives into account may have unintentional consequences because the resolutions of the narratives differ from each other. Planning for a more sustainable future for Newtown Creek is not simply one where the remnants of a polluted past give way to clean new residences for those who can afford to pay for them. A sustainable Newtown Creek future is one that makes visible and values how the people and processes of Newtown Creek have served the city. Accomplishing planning that protects these people and the processes as sea levels rise and storms intensify is a particular challenge for this coastal metropolis. In conclusion, I hope this case study gives a sense of how Newtown Creek's focus on the past waste management practices, laws, and infrastructure of cities can provide context for contemporary analysis of discards. And I hope this discussion of Newtown Creek indicates how the perspectives of interdisciplinary discard studies can inform new approaches to urban history. I'll conclude with one question I want to ask you to keep in mind as you engage with the papers presented the rest of this week. The University of Pittsburgh's History of the Urban Environment series has a Mexico City volume, but the series wants to include more books on cities in Asia, Africa, and South America in the future. How might books on the histories of discardscapes of cities in Asia, Africa, and South America invite comparisons and contrasts to the story of New York I have told you today? Thank you very much.